The afternoon sun punished the streets of downtown New York when Richard Montgomery left his Porsche Cayenne parked near Union Square. It was unusual to see him in that part of the city, especially alone, but something compelled him to walk there that day. Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps the need to feel something different from the air conditioning and Italian leather that usually surrounded him. At 45, Montgomery was the kind of man who didn't need to introduce himself. Everyone already knew who he was. His imposing figure, strategically disheveled grey hair and tailored Italian suit were his trademark on the covers of the country's main business magazines. The Montgomery empire, built over 3 generations, had become an even greater power under his command. As he walked the busy streets, he observed with a mixture of curiosity and disdain the comings and goings of ordinary people, those he called everyday people in his rare personal interviews. The smell of popcorn mixed with exhaust fumes, street vendors shouted offers, and the city pulsed in its usual chaotic rhythm. It was then that his eyes fixed on something unusual, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, sitting on the sidewalk with a piece of bread in her hands. It wasn't the poverty that caught his attention. He had grown accustomed to ignoring that. It was the way she held that piece of bread as if it were the most precious object in the world, and especially the look. A look that mixed resignation and a dignity that deeply irritated him. Montgomery stopped in front of her, his shadow casting over the girl like a storm cloud. She raised her eyes, meeting his. For a moment, they stood like this, measuring each other in silence. Then, in a movement that surprised even himself, Montgomery leaned down and snatched the bread from her hands. "Let's see if it's so special," he said, taking a demonstrative bite of the stale bread. The girl's reaction was instant and unexpected. Instead of cowering in fear as he imagined she would, she jumped up, her brown eyes flashing with indignation. "Who do you think you are?" she shouted, her voice echoing down the busy street. "Just because you wear that expensive suit, you think you can do whatever you want?" Montgomery laughed, a dry laugh devoid of humor. "Actually, yes, that's exactly what I think." It was then that she did something that no one in the entire history of the Montgomerys had dared to do. She lunged at him, trying to recover what was hers. In the confusion that followed, Montgomery stumbled backward, surprised by the strength of that frail girl. His Italian suit was stained with street dirt, and the bread fell to the ground. What he didn't realize, as he tried to regain his composure, was that dozens of cell phones were already pointed at the scene. In a matter of seconds, the moment was being broadcast live, shared, commented on. The expression of superiority on his face, the desperation and courage in her eyes, everything was being recorded and disseminated over the internet with the speed of a digital virus. "You have no idea what you just did," Montgomery whispered through clenched teeth, straightening his crumpled suit. The girl, still breathless from the confrontation, responded with surprising calm. "No, Mr. Montgomery, you have no idea what you just did." It was only then that he noticed the crowd forming around them, the phones pointed, the murmurs of indignation. His name was already being whispered among the people, some with anger, others with astonishment. The girl remained standing, trembling slightly but not averting her gaze. In his office on the top floor of the Montgomery building, miles away, a silent notification flashed on a computer screen. A specially programmed algorithm had just detected a mention of the Montgomery name on social media. The share counter began to spin like a taximeter at rush hour. At the same time, in a windowless room somewhere in the city, a group of people watched the scene unfold on multiple monitors. A man with thin glasses smiled discreetly and gestured to his team. "It has begun," he said simply. "Activate the Phoenix protocol." The next 24 hours turned into a whirlwind for Richard Montgomery. The video of the incident went viral with impressive speed, reaching millions of views before his public relations department could even draft a response. The hashtags Montgomery Jerk and Justice for the Girl dominated the trending topics, and each new hour brought an even bigger wave of indignation. In his penthouse in Manhattan, Montgomery watched the demolition of his reputation with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The screens of his home theater simultaneously displayed different news channels, all covering the same subject: the powerful businessman who humiliated a homeless teenager. "It's impossible that this is happening," he muttered to himself as he poured his third shot of whiskey. Impossible that such an insignificant incident. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Concerned shareholders, nervous business partners, journalists eager for a comment. Marina Vasquez, his press officer for over a decade, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "Richard, you need to make a statement," she insisted for the 10th time that morning. "The silence is killing us. We've already lost 3 important contracts, and the stocks have fallen 12% just today." But there was something strange about the whole situation that deeply bothered him. The organization of the attacks on social media, the speed with which the press reacted, the way every aspect of his life was being scrutinized and exposed. It seemed meticulously orchestrated. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the girl now identified as Sarah Thompson was being welcomed by an NGO called Voices of Tomorrow. Sandra Miller, the organization's director, received her personally, her eyes shining in a way that Sarah couldn't decipher. "You're safe now, dear," Sandra assured, leading her down a hallway decorated with photos of smiling children. "We're going to take care of you." Sarah observed everything with a mixture of fascination and distrust. In just a few hours, she had gone from the streets to an environment that seemed out of a dream. Clean bed, hot food, new clothes. But something in her instinct, sharpened by years on the streets, warned her that nothing in life comes without a price. "There are a lot of people wanting to talk to you, Sarah," Sandra explained, her professional smile never wavering. "Your story has touched the hearts of millions of people. You can become a symbol of hope and change." In the room next door, a team of professionals was already working tirelessly. Stylists discussed the best way to present her to the public. Writers prepared her speech for future interviews. Marketing experts planned every detail of her transformation. "We need you to tell your story, Sarah," Sandra continued. "The world needs to know who the girl is that stood up to Richard Montgomery." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "But I don't know if I want to be a symbol," she replied softly. "I just wanted my bread back." Sandra laughed, a melodious sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh dear. Sometimes destiny chooses us for bigger roles than we imagine. Trust me, this is just the beginning." That same night, as Sarah adapted to her new reality, Montgomery received an unexpected visit. Arthur Lewis, a former high-ranking employee who had been dismissed months earlier, appeared in his office without warning. "You need to see this," Arthur said, placing a folder on Montgomery's desk. "I found some interesting patterns in the posts against you. There's a structure behind all of this, an organization that moves in the shadows." Montgomery leafed through the documents with growing interest. Graphs showed synchronized peaks of activity on different platforms, analyses revealed patterns in seemingly random comments, and one name began to repeat itself in different contexts: Aurora Foundation. "What is this?" Montgomery asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Something much bigger than a viral video," Arthur replied, his eyes reflecting the city light coming through the windows. "Something that started long before that girl crossed your path. And I believe you were already part of their plans for a long time." On the other side of the city, in a comfortable but strange room, Sarah couldn't sleep. Through the window, she could see the lights of New York shining like artificial stars. Her cell phone, a gift from the NGO, wouldn't stop receiving notifications from people wanting to follow her on social media. Taking a piece of paper, she began to write down questions that kept popping up in her mind. Why were so many important people suddenly interested in her story? Why did Sandra seem to know exactly what to do, as if she were following a script? And why, even surrounded by so much comfort and attention, did she feel more alone than ever? Morning arrived with a different clarity in Richard Montgomery's apartment. After a sleepless night poring over the documents brought by Arthur, his mind was buzzing with theories and connections. The Aurora Foundation wasn't just another non-governmental organization. Its tentacles seemed to extend across various sectors of society, always operating in the shadows. "I need more information," he muttered to himself, as his coffee cooled. Untouched on the marble table, the glass walls of his penthouse, which once made him feel on top of the world, now seemed to expose him to invisible eyes. His cell phone vibrated. It was Marina again. "The stocks have fallen another 15%. The board is calling an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Richard, we need to do something." But Montgomery was no longer worried about stocks or the board. His hands trembled slightly as he typed on his laptop, researching every mention of the Aurora Foundation he could find. The organization seemed to have emerged out of nowhere about 5 years ago, always associated with cases of social justice that resulted in the fall of powerful figures. In his private office, a room that not even the housekeeper was allowed to enter, Montgomery began to assemble a panel with all the information he could gather. Photos, newspaper clippings, old documents, all connected by red threads forming a complex web. "This didn't start with me," he muttered, his eyes scanning the connections. "But why now? Why that girl?" On the other side of the city, Sarah faced her own dilemmas. The Voices of Tomorrow NGO had transformed into a well-oiled public relations machine. In just a few days, she had undergone a complete transformation. Designer clothes, professional haircut, diction lessons. "You need to be ready for your first national interview," Sandra explained, adjusting Sarah's new blazer. "Your story will inspire millions of people." But which story, Sarah wondered, as she was prepared for another photo session. The version being constructed seemed increasingly distant from the reality she knew. Every detail of her life on the streets was being carefully edited, polished, transformed into something more palatable for the public. "I don't feel comfortable with this," Sarah tried to argue during one of the media training sessions. "Some things you want me to say didn't happen exactly like that." Sandra smiled that smile that never reached her eyes. "Darling, sometimes we need to adjust the narrative so people understand better. The important thing is the message, not the details." At night, alone in her room, Sarah began to do her own investigations. The laptop she had received from the NGO was certainly monitored, so she used a prepaid cell phone secretly purchased to research the organization and its connections. It was during one of these searches that she found something intriguing. 5 years ago, a photo of Sandra Miller at a charity event. By her side, almost unnoticed in the background, was Arthur Lewis, the same man who was now assisting Montgomery. Meanwhile, Montgomery had come to a disturbing conclusion. Analyzing old family records, he discovered that his father, Anthony Montgomery, had connections with a group called Project Aurora in the 80s. The references were vague, but enough to establish a pattern. "Arthur," he called on the secure phone they had established, "I need you to investigate something about my father and something called Project Aurora." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I'm already one step ahead," Arthur finally replied. "And you won't believe what I found. But we can't talk about this over the phone. There's something about your family you need to know." At the Aurora Foundation headquarters, in a meeting room on the 20th floor of a mirrored building, a group of people watched monitors displaying both Montgomery and Sarah. The man with thin glasses smiled with satisfaction. "Phase 1 completed," he announced to the team. "They're starting to ask the right questions. Initiate Phase 2. A gray-haired woman seated at the head of the table frowned. "Are you sure it's wise to continue? The girl is showing more autonomy than we expected." The man with glasses adjusted his frames with a precise gesture. "On the contrary, this is perfect. The more they investigate, the closer they get to where we want them. After all, some truths are only accepted when people believe they've discovered them on their own." That night, both Montgomery and Sarah slept restlessly, their minds filled with unanswered questions. Both felt they were on the verge of discovering something important, unaware that each step they took towards the truth brought them closer to a revelation that would change their lives forever. The meeting between Montgomery and Arthur took place in a discreet cafe in Greenwich Village, away from the curious eyes that now followed the businessman everywhere. Arthur arrived first, choosing a table in the back of the establishment, his worn leather briefcase contrasting with the modernity of the place. "What did you find out about my father?" Montgomery asked as soon as he sat down, dispensing with any formality. Arthur looked around before answering, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Montgomery. "Your father wasn't just a successful businessman, Richard. He was part of something bigger, something that started as a social project in the 80s, but transformed into something else. Slowly, Arthur began to pull documents from his briefcase. Photos yellowed by time showed Anthony Montgomery at different charity events, always accompanied by the same people. In one particularly revealing one, he appeared next to a woman Montgomery immediately recognized. "This is Helen Vasquez," Arthur explained, noting the look of recognition on Montgomery's face. "Today she's the president of the Aurora Foundation Board, but in the 80s she coordinated the original Project Aurora, which worked with children in vulnerable situations." Montgomery took the photo, studying it carefully. "My father never mentioned anything about this, because something happened in 1989 that made the original project abruptly shut down. All records were erased, and those involved went their separate ways. Your father completely abandoned social work and focused solely on business." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Sarah was about to give her first national interview. The TV studio glowed with artificial lights, and a production team ran from one side to the other, making final adjustments. "Remember what we practiced," Sandra whispered in her ear. "You are the voice of the invisible, Sarah. Use that." But something in the morning had deeply disturbed Sarah. During her breakfast, as she absently flipped through an old magazine in the NGO's waiting room, her eyes caught something familiar. A photo of her mother, Mary Thompson, dated 1989. In the image, her mother, still a teenager, was in front of a building with the Project Aurora logo. "Sandra," Sarah called moments before the interview began, "did you know my mother?" The question caught Sandra off guard, something rare to happen. For a moment, her professional smile faltered. "Why do you ask that, dear?" "I found a photo of her in an old magazine with the same Aurora Foundation logo, but from years ago." Sandra adjusted Sarah's microphone with precise gestures, buying time. "Many people have passed through our projects over the years, but now is not the time to talk about that. You have an important interview to give." Back at the cafe, Montgomery was absorbing more disturbing revelations. Project Aurora wasn't just a social initiative, Arthur continued. They were developing a system, a method of identifying and shaping young talents, children with the potential to become leaders, influencers, agents of change. But something went wrong. "What kind of thing went wrong?" Montgomery asked, his voice low and tense. "I don't know exactly," Arthur replied, "but I found records of an emergency board meeting in December 1989. After that, the project was shut down, all files were sealed, and the children were relocated to different institutions." Montgomery felt a shiver run down his spine. "And today's Aurora Foundation? It's a resurrected version of the original project, but with different objectives. They're no longer just interested in shaping future leaders. They're determined to bring down the current ones. And you, Richard, are not the first Montgomery on their list." On the cafe's TV, Sarah's interview was beginning to be broadcast. "Liv." Montgomery raised his eyes to the screen, observing the transformation of the girl who just a few days ago was on the streets. There was something familiar in her gestures, in the way she slightly tilted her head when speaking. "This girl," Arthur said, following Montgomery's gaze, "wasn't chosen by chance. You need to find out who her mother is." In the studio, Sarah was answering questions with rehearsed ease, but her mind was elsewhere. In the photo she had found, her mother wore a necklace with a small phoenix-shaped pendant, the same symbol she had seen tattooed on Helen Vaughan's wrist during a Foundation board meeting. In her office at the Aurora Foundation, Helen watched the interview with clinical interest. Beside her, an old folder contained two photos, one of Mary Sanders in 1989 and another of Sarah taken the week before. On the desk, an unopened DNA test waited to reveal a long-buried truth. "It's time," Helen murmured to herself, picking up the phone. "Initiate Phase 3. Bring Anthony Montgomery back to New York." Anthony Montgomery hadn't set foot in New York in 5 years. Since retiring, he preferred the tranquility of his ranch in upstate New York, away from the spotlight and memories the city held. However, the phone call he received the night before left him no choice. "They found the girl, Anthony." Helen Vaughan's voice sounded exactly as he remembered, even after all these years. We can no longer postpone the inevitable. Now sitting in the back of an armored Mercedes cutting through the FDR drive, Anthony observed the city he had helped build with tired eyes. Beside him, an old folder contained documents he never imagined he'd have to review again. At the same moment, Sarah was finishing her first week of interviews and public appearances. Her story had touched the heart of the nation, and social media talked about nothing else, but the more her fame grew, the more questions arose in her mind. "Sandra," she called, entering the NGO director's office unannounced, "I need to know the truth about my mother." Sandra looked up from her laptop, her usual smile giving way to a more serious expression. "Sarah, honey, some truths are too complicated." "Don't call me honey," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "I found more old photos. My mum wasn't just another person who went through the project. She was important, wasn't she?" Before Sandra could answer, her phone rang. Seeing the number, her face paled slightly. "I need to take this," she said, gesturing for Sarah to leave. "We'll continue this conversation later." Sarah left the office, but not before seeing the name flashing on Sandra's cell phone screen, Helen Vaughan. Meanwhile, Richard Montgomery was facing his own crisis. The board meeting had been brutal. Shareholders were demanding his immediate resignation. But something in the recent discoveries prevented him from simply accepting defeat. "We need to find Mary Sanders," he said to Arthur, who continued sifting through old files. "If she was part of the original Aurora project, she might be the key to understanding what's happening now." Arthur removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "That's the problem, Richard. Mary Sanders disappeared 15 years ago. The last records of her are from a public hospital in 2010, when she was admitted with her young daughter. After that, nothing." "The daughter," Montgomery murmured, a sudden realization hitting him. "Sarah." At that moment, Montgomery's phone rang. The number was unknown, but something made him answer. "Son," Anthony's voice sounded grave on the other end of the line, "we need to talk, now." The meeting was set at the old Montgomery family mansion, a property that had remained closed since the matriarch's passing 3 years earlier. When Richard arrived, he found his father in the study, the same place where so many important decisions had been made in the past. "Why did you never tell me about Project Aurora?" Richard asked without preamble. Anthony sighed deeply, pouring himself a drink. "Because I hoped that past would never catch up to us, but now—" He opened the folder he had brought with him, revealing a photo that made Richard freeze. In the image, dated 1989, a group of young people posed in front of the old project building. Among them was Mary Sanders, smiling timidly at the camera. And beside her, with an arm over her shoulders, was Anthony Montgomery, at least 20 years younger. "She wasn't just another project participant," Anthony said, his voice trembling slightly. "Mary was special. We all knew it. Helen more than anyone." "What happened to her?" Richard asked, though a growing fear in his chest suggested he might not want to know the answer. "It's complicated," Anthony began, but was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Helen Vaughan entered the study as if she still owned the place, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. Behind her, to everyone's surprise, was Sarah. "I think it's time all the cards were laid on the table," Helen announced, her gaze alternating between Anthony and Richard. "Sarah deserves to know the truth about her mother, and you, Richard, deserve to know why this girl was chosen to be the instrument of your downfall." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Anthony. There was something familiar in that aged face, something she couldn't explain. "Who was my mother, really?" she asked, her voice barely containing the emotion. "And why do all of you seem to know more about her than I do?" The silence that followed Sarah's question was as dense as fog. In the old study of the Montgomery mansion, the late afternoon shadows danced on the walls, silent witnesses to a truth about to come to light. Helen Vaughan was the first to speak, her voice controlled as always. "Mary Sanders wasn't just another young person in the project," she began, removing a brown envelope from her folder. "She was our greatest promise, our example of success, a girl who came from the streets and transformed herself into a natural leader." "Like me?" Sarah asked with a hint of irony. "Is that why you chose me?" Not exactly, Helen replied, her eyes turning to Anthony Montgomery. You tell her, Anthony. After all, you were the closest to her. Anthony took a deep breath, his shoulders heavy with the burden of decades of secrets. Mary was different from all the other young people in the project. She had a vision, a natural ability to understand people and their needs. While we were thinking about creating business leaders, she dreamed of real changes in society. Richard watched his father with a mixture of fascination and growing horror. He had never seen him so vulnerable, so human. We fell in love, Anthony continued, his voice almost a whisper. It was a mistake, I know. I was married, I was one of the project directors. But Mary, she had something special. Something that made you believe anything was possible. Sarah felt her legs weaken, needing to lean on a nearby armchair. You and my mother. Helen intervened, her voice sharp as ice. That's when everything started to crumble. Their relationship threatened to expose not just the personal scandal, but the entire real purpose of Project Aurora. What purpose? Richard asked, his voice betraying contained anger. Social control, Helen answered simply. We weren't just helping underprivileged youth. We were creating a network of influence, people strategically positioned at all levels of society. Mary was the first to realize this and threatened to expose everything. Anthony stood up, walking to the window. When Mary discovered she was pregnant, everything changed. She didn't want her child to be part of this manipulation game. She tried to leave the project, expose the truth. And then you silenced her, Sarah completed, tears of anger streaming down her face. No, Anthony turned abruptly. I helped her escape. I gave her money, new documents, everything she needed to disappear. It was the least I could do after. His voice failed. Helen smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. And it was your biggest mistake, Anthony, because Mary didn't just run away. She took with her enough evidence to destroy everything we had built. Evidence she hid very well, waiting for the right moment. Richard, who had been observing everything in shock, began to connect the dots. The flash drive? Helen raised an eyebrow. What flash drive? Arthur found mentions of a flash drive in Mary Sanders' last records, Richard explained, his mind working quickly. Something she stored in a safe place before disappearing, Sarah completed, her gaze fixed on Helen. But she didn't disappear, did she? You found her. Helen's smile widened slightly. Mary was smart, but she made a fatal mistake. She trusted the wrong people. When we finally located her, she had prepared a contingency plan. The flash drive, as you call it, contains not just evidence of the original project, but something much more valuable. What? Anthony and Richard asked in unison. The complete list, Helen replied. All the names, all the connections, the entire system we've built over decades. And Mary ensured that this information would only come to light when her daughter was ready. Sarah stood up, facing Helen. And that's why you brought me here. To use a street girl's trauma as an excuse to bring down the Montgomerys? Helen laughed softly. Oh dear, you still haven't understood, have you? We didn't choose you to bring down the Montgomerys. You are a Montgomery. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard staggered backward, his mind processing the implication of those words. Sarah stared fixedly at Anthony, seeing for the first time traces of herself in his aged face. This means, Sarah began, her voice trembling. It means you're my granddaughter, Anthony completed, tears streaming down his face. And that all this manipulation was just the beginning. Helen walked to the door, stopping before leaving. The real story is just beginning. And now that everyone knows their true roles in it, we can move on to the next phase. As the door closed behind her, 3 generations of the Montgomery family remained in silence, each absorbing the weight of the revelations and wondering what other secrets were yet to come. The hours following the revelations in the Montgomery mansion seemed to pass in slow motion. Sarah had retreated to one of the upstairs bedrooms, surrounded by photographs of a family she had just discovered was her own. On the wall opposite the bed, one portrait in particular caught her attention. A young Mary Sanders, radiant in a simple dress during what appeared to be an Aurora project party. Downstairs, Richard and Anthony Montgomery tried to process the situation in a silence heavy with unspoken words. The whiskey in their glasses remained untouched. "Why did you never tell me?" Richard finally asked, his voice more tired than angry. Anthony ran his hand through his grey hair. "How could I? Your mother, she was already sick at the time. And then Mary disappeared, taking Sarah with her. I thought I had done the right thing protecting everyone." "Protecting?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "Look where we are now, Dad. The Aurora Foundation manipulated us like chess pieces. They used my own niece to publicly destroy me." In the makeshift office Arthur had set up in a nearby hotel, the screens of several computers displayed documents and old photos from Project Aurora. His phone rang. It was a contact inside the foundation. "They're planning something big for tomorrow," the voice whispered on the other end of the line. "Helen is going to make a public announcement that will change everything. Something about a file Mary Sanders left." In the bedroom, Sarah held her cell phone, rereading the last messages exchanged with Sandra. Now it all made sense. The NGO's sudden interest, the intensive training, the meticulous construction of her public image. It wasn't just about exposing the arrogance of the powerful. It was about strategically positioning her for what was to come. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Richard. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice stripped of the arrogance Sarah had known in that first encounter on the street. Sarah nodded, curiously observing the man she now knew to be her uncle. Richard entered, carrying an old box. "I found this in my father's office," he explained, sitting on the edge of the bed. "They're letters your mother wrote during her time in the project. I thought you might like to see them." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the first letter. Her mother's handwriting, firm and determined, filled the yellowed pages. "Dear Diary, today I discovered something disturbing about Project Aurora. It's not just a social program. It's a complex network of manipulation. They choose specific people, shape their lives from an early age, positioning them strategically in different sectors of society. It's like a global chess game and we're just pawns." "She knew everything," Sarah murmured, leafing through more letters. "That's why she ran away. And that's why the Aurora Foundation never stopped looking for her," Richard completed. "Whatever is on that flash drive your mother hid must be powerful enough to expose not just the past, but also the present of the organization." At that moment, Sarah's cell phone vibrated with a message from Helen. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., press conference. At the Foundation headquarters, your presence is crucial. It's time to honor your mother's legacy." Sarah looked at Richard, a new determination in her eyes. "They expect me to be just another piece in their game, but my mom didn't run away for me to become a puppet." Richard smiled, for the first time clearly seeing Mary's traits in his niece. "Then let's turn the game around." In the Foundation's meeting room, Helen reviewed the final details for the next day. On her computer screen, an encrypted file blinked, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Beside her, an old photo showed the original Aurora Project group, all young and smiling, unaware of the role they would play decades later. "The Montgomerys have always been important pieces on our board," she murmured to herself, "but they never imagined they were just the beginning." Back at the mansion, Anthony Montgomery removed an old safe from behind a panel in the library. Inside it, besides documents and photos, was a flash drive identical to the one Mary had hidden. "There are some truths," he whispered, "that not even Helen knows." The night advanced, and at different points in the city, the players in this intricate game prepared for what was to come. Sarah, lying on the bed that had once belonged to her grandmother, held her mother's letters close to her heart, feeling she was on the verge of discovering not just her past, but also her destiny. The dawn found Sarah, Richard, and Anthony still awake in the Montgomery Mansion library. Dozens of scattered documents covered the mahogany table, forming a mosaic of secrets from the past. Arthur had arrived a few hours ago, bringing more pieces of the puzzle with him. "Look at this," Arthur said, spreading some newly discovered photos. "Helen Vaughan wasn't just the coordinator of Project Aurora. She had a particular obsession with certain families, especially the Montgomerys." The photos showed Helen at different times, always close to the family, always observing. In one particularly disturbing one, she appeared in the background of a charity event, her gaze fixed on a pregnant Mary Sanders. "She monitored us," Anthony murmured, recognizing events he never imagined had been watched. But why? Sarah, who had spent the last few hours devouring her mother's letters, looked up from the papers. "I think I found something. Mom wrote about a secret meeting she witnessed weeks before she ran away." Everyone turned to her as she read, "I can't sleep after what I heard today. Helen and the board aren't just creating leaders, they're building dynasties. Entire families being molded through generations, like living social experiments. The Montgomerys are just one of the main branches of something much bigger. They call it Project Legacy." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Project Legacy? Arthur quickly typed something on his laptop. This explains a lot. It wasn't just about immediate social control. They were thinking in decades, generations. "And I was part of the plan even before I was born," Sarah completed, her voice trembling slightly. "Just like you, Uncle Richard. Just like Grandpa." Anthony abruptly stood up, walking to the safe he had opened hours earlier. "There's one more thing you need to see," he said, removing the flash drive he had kept for so many years. Mary wasn't the only one keeping records. Connecting the device to Arthur's laptop, a series of files began to reveal themselves. They were detailed records, kept secret by Anthony for years, documenting every suspicious move by the Aurora Foundation. "Helen made a mistake in thinking I was just a lovesick businessman," Anthony explained, his voice laden with a long-dormant strength. "After Mary ran away, I started my own investigation. Every contract, every donation, every new board member, it's all here." Richard examined the files with growing admiration. "Dad, this is pure dynamite," Arthur completed. "With this, we can not only expose the original Aurora project, but the entire current structure of the foundation." Sarah, however, had another concern. "But what about my mom's flash drive? Helen seems very confident about what she's going to reveal tomorrow." "That's where things get interesting," Arthur smiled, turning his laptop so everyone could see. "I managed to access some internal foundation emails. They never found Mary's original flash drive. What Helen has is something else." A heavy silence fell over the library as everyone processed this information. Richard was the first to understand the implication. "They're bluffing," he said, a smile appearing on his face. "Helen is going to make an announcement based on information she thinks she has but doesn't. And that gives us an advantage," Sarah completed, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "We can use her press conference against her." Anthony observed his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "Sarah, are you sure? Confronting Helen publicly is dangerous." Sarah stood up, walking to the window. The sun was beginning to rise over New York, painting the sky in shades of pink. "My mom ran away to protect me, to give me the chance to choose my own path. I'm not going to waste that by being manipulated by them." Richard joined her at the window. "Then let's work together. For the first time, the Montgomerys will fight united." Arthur was already furiously typing on his laptop. "I have some press contacts who aren't controlled by the foundation. I can make sure they're present at the conference. And I," Anthony added, "can summon some former project members who also revolted against Helen. It's time to bring all the ghosts to light." As the sun rose on the horizon, the four finalized their plan. In a few hours, they would face not just Helen Vaughan, but an entire system built over decades. The Montgomery mansion, which for so long had kept secrets, now served as the headquarters for its own revolution. In her luxurious apartment, Helen finished the final preparations for the press conference, unaware that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. On her desk, next to the fake flash drive she planned to use as a trump card, was a last photo of Mary Sanders, taken weeks before her escape. "You thought you had won, Mary," Helen murmured to the photograph, "but your daughter will complete the cycle you tried to interrupt." Fate, however, had other plans, and in a few hours all masks would fall. As the last words echoed through the auditorium, a profound silence fell over the crowd. Journalists who had come expecting a scandal found themselves witnesses to something far more extraordinary. a story of redemption, family, and the power of truth. Sarah stood tall on the stage, flanked by Richard and Anthony, with Helen joining them in a show of unity that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The flashes of cameras captured this moment, a new chapter in the Montgomery legacy. In the days that followed, the story of Project Aurora and the Montgomery family dominated headlines across the nation. The revelation of Helen's true identity and the complex web of manipulation she had woven sent shockwaves through New York's elite circles. The Aurora Foundation, once a shadowy organization built on secrets, began a dramatic transformation. Under Sarah's guidance and with input from Richard and Anthony, it was reshaped into a truly transparent organization dedicated to social change. Helen, stripped of her secrets, but freed from the burden of her lifelong deception, found an unexpected peace. She worked closely with Sarah, sharing her knowledge and connections to help redirect the Foundation's resources towards genuine community support. Richard Montgomery, his public image redeemed, used his business acumen to ensure the Foundation's financial stability as it transitioned to its new mission. He found a renewed sense of purpose, working alongside his niece to build something meaningful. Anthony, after years of carrying the weight of his secrets, found solace in reconnecting with his granddaughter and reconciling with his half-sister. He became a valuable advisor, his experience bridging the gap between the old guard and the new vision. As for Sarah, she embraced her newfound family and heritage with both enthusiasm and caution. She understood the power and responsibility that came with the Montgomery name, but she was determined to use it for good. The flash drive Mary Sanders had hidden all those years ago was never found, but its purpose had been served. The threat of its revelation had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the truth coming to light. In the months that followed, Sarah oversaw the creation of numerous programs aimed at providing opportunities for underprivileged youth, not to manipulate them, but to genuinely empower them. The lessons learned from Project Aurora were used to identify and nurture talent, but with transparency and ethical considerations at the forefront. 1 year after the fateful press conference, the Aurora Foundation hosted a gala to celebrate its rebirth. The event was held in the same auditorium where everything had changed, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. As Sarah took the stage to deliver her speech, she looked out at the crowd. There were familiar faces, Richard, Anthony, Helen, but also hundreds of new ones, beneficiaries of the Foundation's new programs, community leaders, and partners in their mission. A year ago, we stood in this room and tore down the walls of secrecy and manipulation, Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. Today we gather to celebrate what we've built in its place. The Aurora Foundation is no longer about control or hidden agendas. It's about opportunity, transparency, and the belief that every person deserves the chance to write their own story. She paused, her eyes finding Helen in the audience. We've learned that the strongest legacies are not built on power over others, but on empowering others. That true strength comes not from secrets, but from honesty and compassion. As Sarah continued her speech, detailing the Foundation's achievements and future plans, a sense of hope and possibility filled the room. The Montgomery name, once associated with corporate power and scandal, was being redefined. In the back of the auditorium, unnoticed by most, an elderly woman watched with tears in her eyes. Mary Sanders, who had lived in hiding for so long, had finally felt safe enough to emerge from the shadows. She listened to her daughter's words with pride, knowing that her sacrifice had not been in vain. As the applause filled the room at the end of Sarah's speech, Mary slipped out quietly. Her work was done. She had set the wheels in motion long ago, and now she could rest easy, knowing that the truth had finally set everyone free. The story of the Montgomerys and the Aurora Foundation would be told for generations to come, not as a cautionary tale of greed and manipulation, but as a testament to the power of truth, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And so, as the gala continued, and plans for the future were discussed with enthusiasm, a new legacy was being forged. One built not on the shifting sands of secrets and control, but on the solid foundation of honesty, compassion, and the belief that it's never too late to change the narrative of one's life. In her hotel room later that night, Sarah sat at the desk, penning a letter. It was addressed to her mother, though she didn't know if it would ever reach her. In it, she wrote of the changes, the challenges, and the hope for the future. She wrote of forgiveness and understanding, of the family she had found and the legacy she was building. As she sealed the envelope, Sarah smiled. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. The cycle of secrets and manipulation that had defined the Montgomerys for generations had finally been broken. And in its place, a new story was being written, one page at a time. As Sarah placed the sealed letter on her desk, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Richard, his face bearing a mix of exhaustion and excitement. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, holding up a small package. "It just arrived at the foundation office." Sarah's heart raced as she recognized the handwriting on the label. It was her mother's. With trembling hands, she opened the package, revealing a weathered journal and a USB drive. "It's the real flash drive," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Mum must have been watching all along, waiting for the right moment." Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the journal. "There's a note inside." Sarah opened the journal, reading aloud. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light. I've waited years for this moment, watching from afar as you grew into the strong, compassionate woman I always knew you'd be. The flash drive contains the final piece of the puzzle, evidence that will help you understand not just the past, but the potential future. Use it wisely, my love. The legacy you're building is greater than anything I could have imagined. Remember, the most powerful changes often start with a single act of courage. You've already shown yours. Now help others find theirs. With all my love, Mom." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she finished reading. Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's still out there, Sarah, and she's proud of you." Sarah wiped her eyes, a new determination setting in. "We have work to do, Uncle Richard. Mom's right. This is just the beginning." As they began to explore the contents of the flash drive, they realized that Mary Sanders had left them more than just evidence of past misdeeds. She had provided a roadmap for the future, ideas for programs, potential allies, and warnings about those who might resist change. In the weeks that followed, the Aurora Foundation underwent another transformation. With Mary's insights guiding them, Sarah and the team implemented new initiatives that reached far beyond New York. They established mentorship programs, educational grants, and community development projects that began to address systemic inequalities at their roots. Helen, finding a new purpose in her twilight years, became an unexpected ally. Her knowledge of the old power structures proved invaluable in navigating the challenges they faced. She worked tirelessly to make amends, using her connections to open doors that had long been closed to those from underprivileged backgrounds. Anthony Montgomery, inspired by his granddaughter's vision, decided to write a memoir. In it, he detailed not just the mistakes of the past, but the lessons learned and the hope for the future. The book became a bestseller, sparking national conversations about privilege, responsibility, and the potential for change. 1 year after receiving Mary's package, Sarah stood once again in front of a crowded auditorium. This time, however, the audience was different. Alongside business leaders and politicians sat community organizers, educators, and young people from all walks of life. "A year ago we received a gift," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. "Not just evidence of past wrongs, but a challenge for the future. We were given the opportunity to redefine what legacy means." She paused, looking out at the diverse faces before her. Legacy isn't about maintaining power or keeping secrets. It's about the impact we have on others, the doors we open, and the changes we inspire. Each of you here today is part of that legacy. Each of you has the power to write a new chapter in your community's story. As Sarah continued her speech, detailing the Foundation's achievements and future plans, a sense of possibility filled the room. The Montgomery name, once synonymous with corporate power, was now becoming associated with social change and empowerment. In the back of the auditorium, a figure watched silently, a proud smile on her face. Mary Sanders, finally feeling safe. Enough to emerge from hiding, listened as her daughter's words echoed her own long-held dreams. As the applause filled the room, Mary slipped out quietly. Her work was done, but a new journey was just beginning. She left behind a note for Sarah, knowing it would find its way to her. The truth has set us all free. Now let's see how high we can soar. I'll be watching, always proud, always loving. Mom. Sarah, sensing a familiar presence, turned towards the back of the room just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure leaving. Though she couldn't be sure, her heart told her who it was. With renewed energy, she continued her speech, knowing that somewhere out there, her mother was smiling. As the event concluded and plans for the future were enthusiastically discussed, it was clear that a new era had begun. The legacy of the Montgomerys and the Aurora Foundation was being rewritten, not as a cautionary tale of greed and manipulation, but as an inspiring story of redemption, empowerment, and the enduring strength of truth. Sarah, surrounded by her newfound family and dedicated team, knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, but armed with the truth, guided by compassion, and inspired by the courage of those who came before, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The cycle of secrets had been broken, and in its place a new legacy was blossoming, one of openness, opportunity, and the unwavering belief in the power of second chances. As night fell over New York City, lights flickered on in the Aurora Foundation building. Inside, Sarah and her team worked late, poring over new proposals and planning their next moves. The work of change was never done, but with each small victory they were proving that a different kind of power, one built on trust and shared purpose, could indeed change the world. And somewhere out there, Mary Sanders watched over her daughter, knowing that the seeds she had planted so long ago had finally bloomed into something beautiful and enduring. The story of the Montgomerys wasn't over. It was just beginning its most inspiring chapter yet.